Everybody. In this lecture, we're going to go over the Enlightenment from 1650 to 1800s, about science and new ways to look at the world. And this is going to lead to a number of revolutions, and ultimately our own democracy is going to come out of the air of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment marks the divide between the medieval view of the world dominated by religious principles and religious faith, and the modern view of the world governed by science and the principles of human reason, and the belief that reason can lead us out of the darkness and towards our own personal enlightenment and societal enlightenment. And also a belief that if we're rational, we can become maybe more perfected humans. The chapter after this, in the Romantic era, that really gets questioned, and the idea that we are rational beings maybe isn't really fully the whole picture, because we are completely irrational, completely emotional beings, and we do a lot of dumb stuff because we go through, fits of emotion. So in this time period, I see the Western society looking to science and reason for the betterment of humankind, and this is coming out of the inspiration of the scientific revolution, which will also later spurn the Industrial Revolution as well. We're getting new tools, new experimental methods for investigating the natural world, really taking to heart the empirical method that we saw started with Aristotle. It was an optimistic time that believed in human progress and human perfectibility. And later on, we will see Friedrich Nietzsche say there is no such thing as progress. We simply revolve in circles. Enlightenment thinkers are calling for greater social and political equality and challenging the aristocratic culture of Europe's absolutist courts. And also, we see the style of art Rococo being the later form of the Baroque, changing in favor of the more rational neoclassic in this neoclassic revival that we started to look at when we were looking at Louis XIV. So the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution took place over a period of 150 years, from approximately 1600 to 1750, rooted in a long history of inquiry that began in ancient times, advanced by Muslim scholarship, and it culminates in the union of three movements. Number one, the effort to arrive at scientific truths by means of direct observation and experimentation, that is, empirical methods. Number two, the use of mathematical theory as a method of verification. And number three, the development of new instruments by which to measure natural phenomenon, test scientific hypotheses, and predict the operations of nature. So the first of these movements was already evident in the High Renaissance, in the pioneering investigations of Leonardo da Vinci. We see this also in the Flemish physician Andreas Vesalius. I have a slide that I didn't talk about of Rembrandt in the anatomy lection of Dr. Tulip from 1632, where we see this idea of studying anatomy, cutting open cadavers, and really trying to get accurate descriptions of human anatomy. At the same time, let me see here, Nicholas Copernicus, Nicholas Copernicus, and Copernicus is publishing his landmark treatise on revolution and the heavenly spheres in 1543. On the evidence of mathematical calculations, Copernicus had discarded the traditional geocentric, Earth-centered model of the universe in favor of a heliocentric, a sun-centered theory. And he believed that the planets all circled the sun. Later on, Johann Kepler, we looked at him briefly, he creates a new astronomy. And he is speculating on magnetic forces emitted by the sun, and also indicated that the planets are not moving in circles, but in fact are moving in elliptical orbits. He argued that the magnetic force emitted from the sun determined movements of the planets and their distances from the sun. He's also challenged the model of the universe along with Copernicus, the model that Aristotle had set up that said that the Earth was the center of the universe, or the unmoved mover. That, as we know, obviously is not true. But without sophisticated abilities to observe, that was very hard to prove. So Galileo is advancing Kepler's model for the universe, and also imperiling his own freedom for his life by doing so by his inquiries into motion and gravity. He believes that there is a law of falling bodies, and that the Earth's gravity attracts all objects regardless of shape, size, and density at the same rate of acceleration. He perfected a telescope that revealed new worlds that he could see, the craters of the moon, the rings of Saturn, the moons of Jupiter, and also these operated exactly like the Earth's moon. So there's something very similar happening. Now, he did arouse opposition from the church, but it was ultimately from his publications that poked fun at outmoded theories of astronomy, and he was brought to Rome on charges of heresy. After a long and unpleasant trial in 1633, he was forced to admit to his errors and then condemned to reside in house arrest near Florence. From Isaac Newton, we get a formulated laws of motion and universal gravity that forms the dominant scientific viewpoint until it is superseded by the theory of relativity from Einstein. So even though these new minds in science are making huge breakthroughs, there are still limitations in terms of what they're able to see. And that certainly continues all the way into today, and certainly with theories like string theory as well, that is talked about in our last chapter. He built the first practical reflecting telescope and also developed a sophisticated theory of color based on the observation that a prism separates white light into colors. He also publishes a work on light, highly influential book called Optics. Francis Bacon and the empirical method. So essential to the scientific revolution is the advancement of the empirical method, a process that depends on direct observation of nature and experimentation. So one may draw general conclusions from the process of inductive reasoning, if you remember from Socrates. And Francis Bacon promoted a system of experimentation, tabulation, and record keeping that becomes the touchstone of modern scientific inquiry. His Novum Organum was an impassioned plea for objectivity and clear thinking, and his defense of the empirical method. In his empirical method, He believes that, again, the direct observation of nature and the conclusions are what is important. He also wages war against four false notions, or four idols, as he calls them, that are hindrances to full understanding. Number one are the idols of the tribe, the deceptive idea that have their foundation in human nature, as our natural inclination to accept and believe what we prefer to be true. Idols of the cave are privately held fallacies that derive from individual education and background. For example, the argument that one's own religion is the true faith. His third idol is the idol of the marketplace that arises from the ill or unfit choices of words. For example, the use of the noun mankind to designate all human beings. And then finally, the idols of the theater, the false dogmas perpetuated by social and political philosophies and institutions. For example, the divine right of kings would be one. So we need to purge the mind of prejudice and false thinking, and we must destroy these idols. In an age dominated by spirituality, Bacon is calling for a separation of science and religion. The Royal Society. In 1645, the Royal Society of London is improving natural knowledge, and they are meeting over the centuries. They have attracted thousands of members, and their achievements are confirming one 19th century historian assessments of Bacon that the man that moved the minds moved the world. So the Royal Society is a society that's founded in 1660, 6 years before the London burns and is rebuilt. They are granted a royal charter by King Charles II, and they are groups of physicians, natural philosophers that are meeting at a variety of locations and are influenced by new science and are looking and conducting communications of science and looking at revolutionary advancements. This is a pretty famous painting of a vacuum, and we are seeing a bird suffocate in the vacuum, and it being a little bit hard to watch for some of these people. Other people are fascinated by the science of it. Hooke's Micrographia, the illustrations that Hooke made of these things he saw through his microscope, like the flea we saw in the last chapter, was published in 1665. They published Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica and Benjamin Franklin's kite experiment demonstrating the electrical nature of lightning. We also have a lunar society in Great Britain that it was a dinner club of prominent figures that met regularly between 1765 and 1813. The heart of the society was Matthew Boulton, an industrious who built James Watt's steam engines. The Watt steam engine, alternately known as Bolton and the Watt steam engine, was an early steam engine and one of the driving forces of the Industrial Revolution. So in the 1600s, these are some of the things that we are finding in terms of new ways of seeing the world. Galileo improves on the Dutch telescope to 30 power magnification. William Harvey is tracing the circulation of blood. Descartes is introducing analytical geometry. Pascal is inventing the mercury barometer. Christian Huygens, is developing the first accurate pendulum clock. Leeuwenhoek is discovering microscopic protozoa. Isaac Newton is using a prism to analyze light in 1666. And Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz invents a machine that multiplies and divides numbers. René Descartes. So, Descartes and the birth of modern philosophy. He believed in abstract reasoning and mathematical proof. He advocated deductive reasoning as the best procedure for scientific investigation, the reverse of the inductive method. And again, closer to what we studied from Aristotle. So remember, Socrates was about inductive and Aristotle was about deductive, and here we are again. So in the deductive method, you begin with clearly established general premises and then move towards the establishment of particular truths. He set forth his rules for reasoning as never accepting anything as true that you do not clearly know to be true. Number two, you dissect a problem into as many parts as possible and reason from simple to complex. And then finally, three, you draw a complete and exhaustive conclusion. So he begins his discourse on the method of rightly conducting the reason and seeking for truth of sciences in 1637 and calling everything into doubt, even his own existence as a thinking being. Or he proceeds to identify the first thing that he could not doubt, his own existence as a thinking individual. He expressed this truth in the proposition cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This becomes the first principle of all of his major arguments. On the basis of self-evident propositions, Descartes arrives at the conclusions to which empirical confirmation was irrelevant. His rationalism, like mathematical propositions, involved a process of mind independent of the senses. Descartes also concluded that God must exist. The idea of God, he reasoned, must come from God since nothing can proceed from nothing. Despite his Jesuit background, Descartes identifies God with the mathematical order of nature rather than being a supernatural being or a personal redeemer. The father of modern philosophy made a clear distinction between physical and psychical phenomenon. That is, between matter and mind and between body and soul. So he has a dualistic model, again, something we saw in Plato, something we saw from St. Augustine, and that he believes the human body operates much like a computer would today, with an immaterial mind, the software informing the physical components of the body, the hardware. Cartesian dualism dominates European philosophic thought until the end of the 19th century. Go back to Newton here for a second. So with Newton and his monumental treatise Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles, in 1687, he links terrestrial and celestial physics under a single set of laws, the laws of motion and the laws of universal gravitation, by which every particle of matter attracts every other particle of matter. And this will become the basic of modern physics today. In the Principia, which becomes the culminating thesis of the science revolution, the fundamentals which go unchallenged for until the late 19th century, he says more generally, he promotes an idea of a uniform, intelligible universe that operates as systematically as a well-oiled machine. Here we have a slide on optics by Descartes, and again, Robert Hooke's flea, that is a drawing from him being able to observe a flea. And remember, the flea was responsible for the bubonic plague, to see exactly what those beasts look like. So in the Enlightenment, human beings are beginning to come to terms with natural law and natural rights, like the right to life, liberty, and property, and also just treatment by the ruling order. And understanding the human condition, that is the first step towards progress. We have two theorists in this era, and one of the theorists is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes is a believer that there is a covenant amongst individuals who are willingly surrender a portion of their freedom to a governing authority. This is also something that Sigmund Freud writes about in his Civilization and Discontent. Either one individual or a ruling assembly would be this governing authority, in whom ultimate power is resting. In his work Leviathan from 1651, he justifies his version of the social contract with this argument. It is that human beings are selfish, greedy, and warlike. A strong state is society's only hope for peace and security. So he believes that we are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and human life is short, and that we really need to be controlled or terrible things will happen. This is very similar to the legalism that we studied under the Qin dynasty when we looked at China. On the other side of this argument is John Locke. John Locke is defending the empirical traditions. In Concerning Human Understanding in 1690, he believes that humans are a tabula rasa, a blank state, and that experience, consisting of sensation followed by reflection, writes the script to who we are. There is no innate moral principles or ideas exist. Rather, human knowledge consists of a progressive accumulation of the evidence of the senses. Since human beings are born without any pre-existing qualities, their natural state is one of perfect freedom. He has an optimistic view of human destiny, and he also believes that the social contract, our agreement between citizens and the formation of the state, are mechanisms of the mechanisms that make our government run and us follow the government. So Locke believes that we are equal in potential and capable through reason in defining a common good for us. That common good we also looked at in our lecture on the Greeks. In 1690, of Civil Government, his book, the second of his two political treatises, he expounds on the idea that government must rest on the consent of the governed. People have, by their very nature as human beings, the right to life, liberty, and estate or property, and that the government must arbitrate between the exercise of one person's liberty to that of the next person. If the rule is tyrannical or oppressive, people not only have the right, but also the obligation to rebel, to seek a new ruler or a new form of government. And this, of course, is going to be inspirational. Montesquieu and Jefferson is who we'll look at next. So Charles Louis Montesquieu, I'm sorry I mispronounced that, in his Spirit of Laws in 1748, he defends liberty as the free exercise of will and condemns slavery as fundamentally unnatural and evil. He believes in constitutional monarchy and advances an idea that there should be a separation of powers between executive, legislative, and the judicial agencies in government, and that there must be a balanced system by which we live by. Thomas Jefferson, he is the writer of the Declaration of Independence. He echoes Locke's ideology about our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness instead of the pursuit of power. Following Locke and Montesquieu, he justified the establishment of a social contract between ruler and the ruled as the principal means of fulfilling natural laws and an unalienable right, those rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence is going to make very clear in the America's founding fathers that there should be equality amongst men. However, it is a bit schizophrenic because it does not include women, and it also allows for slavery. So the whole thing is fraught, I think, with wanting to say one thing and wanting to live in another way. Now, another thing about Jefferson that I think is interesting is that he is a deist. And a deist is a new form of, I guess, Christian that is prevalent in the scientific arenas in this time period. Deists believe that there is a God who made the universe, but it is an impersonal God who basically stays out of our way. And this is something that the Romantic artists in the next chapter are going to really start to investigate. The Philosophes. So Jefferson is influenced by an earlier group of French thinkers who are known as the Philosophes. The Philosophes are members of dominate the progress of the Enlightenment through nobility and the middle class. They came together and organized societally, really with ambitious noblewomen, many of who championed a freer and more public role for women. The Philosophes are applying scientific models and the empirical method to all aspects of human life. Reason and clear thinking, they advocated, would release humankind from existing forms of intolerance, inequality, and injustice, and then produce a superior social and moral order. Anti-traditional in spirit, most of the Philosophes subscribed to Descartes' idea of an impersonal God. And this is where the doctrine of deism comes from. They rejected the Bible as revealing truth and scorned the hierarchy and ritual of organized religion. They are also summing up monumental caches of human endeavors with a 35-volume encyclopedia that is written and then published between 1751 and 1772. Published by Denis Diderot, the encyclopedia is a collection of all knowledge scattered over the face of the earth. And of course, the godfather of the all-holy Wikipedia today. In the encyclopedia, that includes the mercury thermometer, the Fahrenheit scale invented in Germany, the first known typewriter is patented in London and talked about, a systematic method for classifying plants. Voltaire, the philosopher and writer, is completing a 7-volume general history of the age of Louis XIV. Outside of the encyclopedia, Rousseau is publishing the first dictionary of music. In 1771, John Hunter's Natural History of Human Teeth lay the foundation of dental science. And we are on a crusade ultimately for progress in all of this. So in this crusade for progress, we are using reason and that there must be a purpose for everything. All events conform to the pre-established harmony of the universe. And we are looking that progress of humanity is something that happens in stages. In The Enlightenment and the Rights for Women, Mary Wollstonecraft, who is a British intellectual, she is attacking the persistence of the female stereotype being docile, domestic, and childlike. Men, she argues, are anxious to turn women into alluring mistresses rather than affectionate wives and rational mothers. As a result, women are more anxious to inspire love than exact respect. Her vindication is a is enjoys a sustained and significant influence today. It is kind of the beginning of the modern movement for female equality. She is also the mother of Mary Shelley, who will write Frankenstein in our next chapter. Immanuel Kant. So, Immanuel Kant, he writes a critique of practical reason published in 1788. He proposed a general moral law and called for a categorical imperative. We should act as if our actions should become the law of all humankind. We must act in ways justified by reason that are so universal that they are good for all people. Again, the common good. It is not enough that our actions have good effects. It is necessary that we will good. And the notion of goodwill is not identical with the Christian mandate do to others as you would do to you, since Kant, ethical conduct is based not on love but on reason, a condition essential to human dignity. For Kant and for the philosophers, traditional rules and formulaics were shackles that prevented people from thinking. Kant said, dare to know. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the youngest of the philosophers. So, in his popular treatise, The Social Contract, in 1762, he says man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Influenced by writings describing native populations in the Americas and elsewhere, he condemned the artificiality of civilized life and exalted what he calls, unfortunately, named the noble savage, as a model of the uncorrupted individual. His writings elevate instinct over reason. Unlike Hobbes, whose contract gave absolute authority to a sovereign power, or Locke, who believed in limited powers of the people, powers from the people, Rousseau defined the state as nothing more than the general will of its citizen, and the general will alone. He explained that the state is according to the object for which it was instituted, that is, again, the common good. For Rousseau, the social contract gave the body politic its absolute power over all of its members. He also had a desire to preserve the natural in human society, which was part of Millet in 1762, a treatise on education. He suggested the unheard of idea that education begins at birth and advocated for hands-on experience in early education. He also, though, was a little backwards and less liberal on his views of female education. He believed that the woman's place was in the home rather than out and equal in the world of men. From Adam Smith, we get the first real major economic theory. An inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, or just called the Wealth of Nations, in 1776, sets forth these laws of labor production and trade. He says that labor is basic to property. The labor force, not land or money, was the foundation of national wealth. And he believed in natural forces like the laws of supply and demand, and which is motivating a free market economy. Markets are driven towards the public good, argued Smith, and led by an invisible hand known as laissez-faire. Literally, allow the markets to act, and everything will kind of work out. He believes that a government is necessary, but should have a limited role in protecting consumers from fraudulent operations. So in other words, he believes the government is kind of a referee in capitalism. In the revolutions in the late 18th century, that are definitely inspired by all of the philosophers and writers that we have been looking at. In 1776, North America's 13 colonies rebel against the British government. And what follows is 7 years of war, several thousand battle deaths, and probably an expense of the war over $100 million. In 1789, they began to function under the Constitution of the United States after they had declared their independence. We looked at that a little bit earlier. In their British political theorist Thomas Paine observed that the revolution had done more to enlighten the world and diffuse a spirit of freedom among humankind than any previous event. In France, there is also a revolution. French history and taxes had fallen exclusively on the shoulders of lower and middle class people, the so-called Third Estate. Almost 3/5 of the average peasant's income went to pay taxes that support privileged upper classes. In 1789, 6,000 angry women are going to march to Versailles to protest the lack of bread in Paris. And then Louis XVI will call a meeting of the Estates General, and the Third Estate will withdraw and form a separate body, claiming the right to approve or veto all taxation. The Third Estate declared itself an independent body, and the great masses of peasants and laborers rioted throughout France. The image that we're seeing here is July 14th, 1789. Crowds stormed the Bastille, the state prison, and destroy the visible symbols of the old French regime. Through the revolution, we get the declarations of the rights of man and the citizen. Modeled on the American Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizens is drafted in 1791 by Olympia de Gouges, and they are demanding equal rights also for women. So in the Declaration for the Rights of Man, we are seeing basically that there are natural rights, and these are universal, and that there are a collective rights for everybody, and these rights are valid for everyone. People are born free, there are rights to property, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man are going to help make the Bill of Rights for the American Constitution in the United States. Now, of course, the French Revolution is bloody, and the French Revolution, unlike the American Revolution, is ultimately going to lead to another revolution that will bring a military dictator into power, Napoleon. And that is maybe one of the differences between France and the United States. The United States considered itself to be one revolution and done, and there have been various revolutions in France. Literature in the Enlightenment. Alexander Pope is a British neoclassicist. He is defending the education of Greek and Latin, largely self-taught. In his essay of Man, he has a philosophical poem that explains humankind's place in the universal scheme. He sees evil as an inherent part of God's design of the universe, and while seemingly imperfect, it is actually, as he says, a mighty maze, but not without a plan. He believes that you should know thyself, then presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man. He is writing essays, and he is also vindicating the ways of God to man in his poem. In newspapers and novels, which are popular because, again, of the printing press, we have 750,000 people that are reading daily newspapers in London. We have salons and cafes. There are journalistic essays, and then also periodicals like the Tatler and the Spectator. In the Spectator, which had a circulation of 25,000 readers, we are looking at modern news magazines. We are anticipating modern news magazines and the ultimate periodicals that will come later in the 19th and 20th century. They are attacking popular urban chauvinism. They are shaping popular opinion. And Samuel Johnson is one of the major pundits of The Spectator. A landmark in literature is an adventure novel, Robinson Crusoe, by Daniel Defoe. Defoe's narrative, based on actual experience, is sharply realistic, different from the fantasy novels of his predecessors. His novels he is talking about a man on an expedition who is trying to bring slaves to Africa, shipwrecked in a storm, and then ultimately spends years trying to survive and kind of understanding what it is to be on your own and what a thinking person kind of really is. This is also an age where we are getting slave narratives, a body of prose written by Africans suffering the cruelty of the transatlantic slave trade. In America, the slave trade of the New World peaks in the 1700s. As England is lured by the lucrative sugar trade, they become a leading player in the traffic and are trafficking some 9 to 12 million humans transported to work and to be ritually abused on plantations in America and the West Indies. They are kidnapping children. They are kidnapping women. And one of the early accounts of this from a slave is Olada Quanau of Benin. So Olada Quanau is kidnapped and enslaved at the age of 11. And both as a slave and after his release from slavery in 1776, he traveled widely. During his stay in England as one of only 30,000 blacks in the mid-1700s, he mastered the English language and became an outspoken abolitionist. His autobiographical narrative, titled Travels from 1789, recounts with dramatic simplicity the traumatic experiences of a child cruelly sold into bondage. It might be believed today that he fabricated some of the tales from his early life to fuel the abolitionist cause, and the accuracy of his descriptions of the Middle Passage and the fate of American slaves are certainly, though, confirmed by first-hand accounts of other slaves. The writing of slave narratives continues well into the 19th century. The movement of abolitionism in the first Great Awakening in the 13 colonies is about rationalist thinkers in the Enlightenment criticizing it for violating the rights of man. So again, in the Enlightenment, we are beginning to see the cracks of slavery starting to form, and the abolitionist movement will ultimately culminate in a civil war in America and Great Britain ending slavery and its slave trade. Satire. So satire is a genre of visual literacy in the performing arts in the form of fiction, sometimes nonfiction, in which vices, follies, abuses, and shortcomings are held up to ridicule, often with the intent of shaming or exposing individuals, corporations, governments, and the society itself into doing a little bit better. Usually it's humorous, but it is really meant as social criticism. Here we're looking at two prints by William Hogarth. One is Beer Street on the left, where when people drink beer, society operates pretty efficiently, people are happy, buildings are doing okay. In Gin Lane, however, the harder alcohol, the entire state has fallen apart, and this drunken woman with sores on her legs is apparently letting her infant fall to his death in her drunken state. With Jonathan Swift, we get a satirist who writes Gulliver's Travels, the story of an imaginary hero who lands with people with little people and giants and fabulous creatures, and each of the people look like what their moral problems are. Little people have moral pettiness and inhumanity. He meets noble horses whose rational behavior is contrasted with the bestiality of their human-looking slaves, the yahoos. It was an immediate sensation. He also writes A Modest Proposal. So in A Modest Proposal, he proposes that the impoverished Irish that people are complaining about might ease their economic troubles by selling their children as food to rich gentlemen and ladies. This hyperbole mocks the heartless attitudes towards the poor as well as Irish policy in general. Voltaire. So Voltaire's satires are an inspiration of the French philosophes. He is born into Parisian middle-class life, educated by Jesuits, and like most philosophes, he condemns organized religion and all forms of religious fanaticism. He is also a deist and compares human beings to mice. And these mice are in the recesses of an immense ship without knowing the captain or its destination. Any confidence that he had in benefit providence was dashed by an earthquake and a tidal wave in 1755 that took the lives of more than 20,000 Portuguese people. For Voltaire, the reality of natural disaster and human cruelty is not easily reconciled with the belief in a good God. In 1,000 Pamphlets and Letters, he attacks bigotry as a man-made evil. He is his biting verse satires in 1717 led to imprisonment in the Bastille. His repeated assaults on royal authority brought about an exile in 1726 and a 3-year stay in England. He had high regard for constitutional government, the principles of tolerance, and the writings of John Locke. In his book Candide, 1759, with the mocking subtitle Optimism, he addresses the age-old question, how can evil exist in a universe governed by the forces of good? Candide follows the exploits of a naive young man through a series of terrible and hilarious adventures, and initially the hero approaches life with glib optimism, and he is extolled by his teacher, Dr. Pangloss, the name that means all tongue, nothing else. And Candide or innocent, soon experiences the horrors of war, religious fanaticism, the disasters of nature, and the dire effects of human greed. The last of these an affliction derived from boredom, according to Voltaire. Candide's personal experience provide the antidote to the comfortable fatalism of Alexander Pope. Whatever is right. After a lifetime of sobering misadventures, he ends his days on a farm in the company of his closest friends. We must cultivate our garden, he concludes with resignation, because there's really nothing else you can do. This metaphor for achieving personal satisfaction in an imperfect world relieves the otherwise devastating skepticism that underlies this moral tale. So there's nothing you can do about the cruel world. All you can do is cultivate your personal garden. the visual arts and the Enlightenment. This is the final aspect of the Baroque, the Rococo style, shells and pearls. We are in a small apartment looking at an oval room full of stucco, gilded tendrils, cupids and garlands. Classically themed artwork is also part of the Rococo interior, and organic patterns of curves and counter curves. So the Rococo is really an extreme version of Baroque in terms of decorations of shell work, the kind used in aristocratic gardens and grottos. Also, these are the decorations of elegant urban townhouses where they are trying to use mirrors and other things to make the spaces look bigger than what they are. In painting in the Rococo, we find the pursuits of pleasure, especially like in this painting by Antoine Watteau, The Departure from the Island Cythera. We look at a fluttering cupid, we're looking at fluttering cupids and the birthplace of Venus, roses at a Venus shrine, and the embarking of wealthy people to have a fête gallant. A fête gallant is a festive diversion in an outdoor setting, and generally it is upper class people going out in these idealized gardens and having orgies and picnics. With Francois Boucher, we get a painter who is sensual and indulgent, often designing mythological scenes, or in this particular painting, turning aristocratic women into something mythical, again with cupids and things like that. One of my favorite artists in the Rococo, and the Rococo is really reviled, I think, in a lot of art history circles. It is seen as indulgent and maybe pointing towards why the heads must roll in the French Revolution. So Jean-Honoré Fragonard is one of Boucher, who he just looks like, most talented pupils, and he is really into the seduction of the pleasures of a waning aristocracy. He creates the swing, and in the swing, painted in 1768, 1769, oil on canvas, 32 by 25 inches, we see the upper class at play in, again, an idealized landscape, and we see this woman in a swing being pushed from the back, her shoe flying off, and we see this guy in the front here trying to look up her skirt. And there is something about these paintings and their general kind of naughtiness that I do find appealing, even though I know intellectually that there are real problems going on here. So ultimately, in the age of the Enlightenment, we get a new art form in neoclassicism. Neoclassicism is the revival of Greco-Roman culture, of course begins with Louis XIV. We see this in painting. We are looking at Jacques-Louis David here. This is the Oath of the Herati. So in neoclassicism, there is a tendency to take on Greek and Roman myths and to also turn current people into classical myths as well. So we're looking at three brothers saluting their dad. They are about to go out and kill their rivals, the Curati. Two of the brothers die. One of the brothers returns. The sisters, who we see here, and again, notice the triangles that are forming here. Again, the triangles that we find in the Renaissance and also the geometry of the Greeks and Plato and things like that. So the sisters of the Haradi here, they are ultimately going to be distraught at this battle. And in fact, one of the sisters is married to one of the Karatis, and her husband is killed. And she's distraught for her husband and not for her dead brothers. And she is going to be killed for that. So it is tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy. Jacques-Louis David's painting is very sober in its space and in its colors, and very crisp in the space like early Renaissance painting. Here from Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, we see a neoclassic rendition of Marie Antoinette. So the unacceptable version was Marie Antoinette here. She was considered to look a little too maybe loose for being the queen in her kind of loose dress here and her hair on her shoulders. So ultimately, she had to conform to the public's imagination of her rather than seeming frivolous and flirtatious. She makes a separate portrait where we see the queen looking exactly like a domestic mother and somewhat frumpy in the way that she is dressed. In neoclassical architecture, we find the Federalist style. This is Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and it represented on the back of a nickel. He is creating for himself a place that is expressing the rationalist ideas, and very similar to the Palladian home that we looked at during the Italian Renaissance. We have a harmony of circles and squares and triangles in here, and again, a kind of triumph of neoclassic rationalism, and also a haven for slavery, which, again, I don't think Thomas Jefferson ever fully reconciled. And we'll talk more about that in our discussion topic coming up. We also, through our rationality, we have a new design for a federal city. So a city will now not just be randomly put together, but laid out on a grid. And some streets would later be named for letters in the alphabet that would travel east-west. Others would be numbers that would travel north-south. And diagonal, broader avenues were named after states in the Union that crossed the north-south, east-west grid. So and the numbers, of course, and the letters would go up consecutively, so you knew really where you were at very easily. In neoclassic sculpture, we get Jean-Antoine Houdon. And Houdon is perhaps the greatest sculptor of the age. I would say the greatest three sculptors in terms of sculpting the figure are Bernini from the Baroque era. He did the David, the Twisting David, of course Michelangelo, and then I would have to put Houdon up there too. One of the things that Houdon comes up with that we can't see in the George Washington portrait, but we can see from this earlier portrait on Thomas Jefferson, is this. And I was always really kind of surprised. So here's a Houdon here, here's another one here. What he does, besides being very good realistically, is he does not carve out parts in the eyes when he's hollowing out the eyes. He leaves out a piece of it that reflects light and reflects the whites in the eyes and give a certain life to the marble that none of those other great sculptors had thought of before him. And I think that that is a pretty excellent innovation on his part. A student of David is Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Here in Ingres, we have the subject of Homer's Iliad, And with Jupiter and Thetis, she is pleading with Jupiter, ruler of the gods, to intervene on behalf of her son Achilles. To the left is Jupiter's jealous wife Juno, who is kind of spying on this whole thing and also will get in the way. Of course, the gods get in the way continually in the Iliad, don't they? So this is kind of what neoclassic painting is all about: clarity of form, restrained emotion, sober colors, shallow space, and classical subject matter, or classicizing contemporary subject matter, like David is doing with Napoleon. And it is ultimately Napoleon, the military dictator, who is going to usurp power after the French Revolution only causes chaos. And here David has created a massive 20-foot painting justifying the coronation of Napoleon as the absolute ruler. Here, David is showing us Napoleon crossing the Alps in this painting that was initially commissioned by the King of Spain. It shows an idealized view of the crossing of Napoleon that he made through the Great St. Bernard Pass in 1800s, leading the troops. He is pointing, his horse is rearing, the horse's mane is moving, the tail is moving forward, and he is a great leader of men. Now, the truth of the matter is that a general should never lead their battles into troop, because they are the brains of the operation. And once they get shot, well, things don't work very well after that. So he really was behind the entire operation with maps and planning out troop movements. In music. So in classical music, we are getting a form that is about the idea of harmony, and that it is classical in terms that it is a serious art. Classical music is generally referred to music between 1760 and 1820. Like neoclassic art, there is symmetry and balance and restraint. It has a model for clarity. It is liberating melody from Baroque polyphony and is anticipating light and graceful melodies in the French Rococo. Classical composers retain the fast, slow, fast contrasts from Baroque instrumental forms, and they are also replacing abrupt changes from loud to soft with more gently graduated contrasts. They're also eliminating the unflagging rhythm and ornate musical embellishment of Baroque polyphony in favor of clear-cut musical phrases. Classical composers are creating the symphony with a full orchestra. So a full orchestra, a symphony orchestra, is about 35 pieces with a clavier, which will become a piano in the middle, a group of 8 violins on the left, the first violins, the second violins on the right. You have violas, cellos next to that. In the middle, you have wind instruments like flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, and trumpets. In the back is where you have your volume and resonance with French horns and trombones, double basses. The mellow harmony is the trumpets and the oboes. Percussion and the rhythm makers are coming from timpanis. In other words, we are seeing the loudest instruments in the back and the more quiet instruments in the front. In this era of the symphony, we have the full orchestra, which I just described. We also have the string quartet. We also have genres that are assuming sections that are cut and divided into 3 or 4 sections. We have allegros in fast tempo, a second andante or a largo that is a moderate or slow tempo in a piece. And then we also have the moderate and slow tempo in the third section that is omitted in concertos. And then it finishes usually in a dance tempo of 3/4 time. And the fourth was again the allegro that it started from. So The organization of the first and last movements, known as sonata form or sonata allegro form. And this calls for a division of the given movement into three parts, and then an exposition or a recapitulation called a coda or a tale. There are also popular amongst the classic composers forms known as theme and variation, changes in rhythm, harmony, and so on. So the birth of the symphony orchestra, we have again all the instruments that I had described, and the strings and the woodwinds and the brass and the percussion, and then also closely tempoed by the clavichord, the the um, the keyboard. Now, of these great composers of this time, we have Franz Joseph Haydn. Haydn is writing operas. He is known as the father of the symphony, and he is Austrian. And his Symphony Number 94 in G major is one of his major compositions, with a fortissimo, a loud instrumental crash to awaken the audience. This fortissimo is known as a surprise. So the surprise is happening in the second movement. So what that means is that you got people listening to your symphony, da 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 da, it's going along, and then maybe people are beginning to go to sleep, and maybe you're even lulling them to sleep, and then there is a huge booming crash with the instruments to wake everybody up. And then you're anticipating perhaps another one of these to come along by the third or fourth movement, but it never will. So I think I have queued up here the beginning before the surprise in Symphony Number 4 in G major. Was that the surprise? I might have missed it. The crashing might have been earlier. I don't want to play too much of it because I don't want to have this thing get blocked. But it's there if you want to. I'm sorry I didn't really have that queued up properly. Maybe one of the more recognizable musicians of the age is Mozart, a child prodigy, a improviser, a sight reader, and is able to kind of flawlessly create whole compositions. He produces, and at early death, produces 650 works, 41 symphonies, 60 sonatas, 23 piano concertos, and 23 string quartets, and 20 operas. One of his maybe best known works is Symphony Number 40. And in Symphony Number 40, written for the string, you will definitely recognize this immediately. So you can clearly recognize the motif here, I'm sure. Okay. The last years of Mozart's life, he writes 4 operas, and many consider these to be his finest operas: The Marriage of Figaro, Thus Do All Women, The Magic Flute, and Don Giovanni. Don Giovanni is about a kind of young, arrogant, sexually promiscuous nobleman who abuses and outrages everyone else in the cast until he encounters something he cannot kill, beat up, dodge, or outwit, which is the spirit statue of the Commodore that he slayed in a duel. And this is ultimately going to destroy him. Now, the last time I made this lecture last year, I got blocked for playing this. It's really hard to know what you're going to get blocked for. So I'm not going to play the music on this. I just want you to kind of see what the Commodore looks like as he is coming upon Don Giovanni. And the end is coming here. So here is, again, great opera in terms of makeup and costuming and sets and, of course, music. Let's see if we can play any of it. The end is coming. The end of Don is coming here. And you can kind of see here with the smoke and everything that it's about over. All right. What I want to get into next is our discussion. Let me bring up my talking head here for you. Okay. So, let my hair down for the long-haired musicians, for the Enlightenment. Okay, so normally in our discussions and assignments so far, I have not strayed very far from the subject matter. And in this chapter and the coming chapters, I am going to kind of expand the time period to begin to look at stuff. We will look at madness in art during the Romantic era. I am going to show you an artist who is about kind of machine-made industrial art when we get to the chapter on industry. And here in the Enlightenment, I wanted to address black culture, inequality from black voices. So this lecture and what I want you to look at and read is titled Blackness in Art. I haven't maybe found the perfect title for it yet, but what I was looking for were black artists talking about what it is to be black in America. And most of these artists are contemporary because you're not going to find these artists on the plantations in the 18th century. So what is it to be black in post-civil rights America, pre-civil rights America, and how are black people representing themselves, and also looking at a racist society and how they are being represented without a voice in the society. And I want to share with you, I think, some of the highlights that you should pay attention to. So this is a artwork by Betty Saar, and this is a artwork she created from a mammy doll. A mammy is a black slave domestic. She arms this mammy with a rifle. And according to Angela Davis, the great Black Panther activist and philosopher, this piece by Saar titled The Liberation of Aunt Jemima sparked the entire black women's movement. There were two women's movements in the 1960s and 70s. One was the feminist movement that was mainly white women, and then there was a movement for liberation for black people that was mainly black men in the civil rights movement, and then a black woman's liberation movement. So Saar is part of the black arts movement, a cultural, often literary arm of the black power movement of the 60s and 70s, and she was also amongst the second wave of feminists, but again found herself at a crossroads of a movement that was male-dominated at one end and a feminist movement that was white-dominated. So she is showing us a militant black woman here who should not be underestimated. Now, Fahamu Paku is a current artist that I have become familiar with and have attended a couple of his shows and a lecture. I don't know if this is the best painting to represent him, although I do like him giving us the finger. Fahamu has a PhD from Emory College, a traditionally black college, and he is interested in representations of black masculinity and identity and kind of playing around with the idea that black men always have to be black and hard. And he is also very much part of and interested as a graphic designer in black driven hip hop music and is often showing us artifacts in that culture in these really fantastic paintings that he makes. Now, I had told you early in the lecture that we would address Thomas Jefferson again, and this is Titus Kaphar. So, Titus Kaphar, behind the myth of benevolence in 2014, we have a painting hanging from the stretcher, which is a portrait of Thomas Jefferson. Behind this formal portrait, we see an image of a black woman. And we know that he had a slave woman named Sally Hemings that he traveled to Europe with. And Sally Hemings agreed to go with him to Europe if she would release her children, and these children that she had born from him, that his children must be freed. And they are after his death. So the painting is interesting because it shows, again, something behind this myth and the myth of benevolence. This slave master, this person who, again, would not free his lover and the mother of his children. And we know that Sally was not this dark in her skin. She was light-skinned, and they call it passing. That her skin was light enough that she could pass as being white. However, Kaphar believes that in America, that blackness is something that is can't be whitewashed, and that blackness and the woman being black is very important in terms of black being something that is kind of absolute in how you're treated in America. The photographer John Henry makes some of the most moving photographs I've ever seen. This is a series called Stranger Fruit. Stranger Fruit is created in the response to murder of African American men due to police violence. And what we see are mothers holding their live but pretending to be dead children. And heartbreaking as that is, what really, I think, puts this to another level is this. We are not seeing a woman in the grief of her recently killed child who needs to be buried. We are seeing a woman who is in the future dealing with the grief that she's going to have to deal with in the moment that she is holding her child. So there is this mixture of future and present in these that is really brilliant, and as much as it is heartbreaking to me. But that idea that there can be two time periods that a work of art can represent at the same time, I think is a really genius idea that isn't traveled that often. Painter Faith Ringgold, she painted a series of paintings. This one is called Die. It's a large painting of 72 by 144 inches, and we are looking at a race riot. And it is bloody. And this is not a race riot of the low class. This is a race riot of professionals in professional dress. And notice that in the middle are a white and black child huddled together in absolute fear. So we are seeing that race violence affects everybody. Renee Cox, I attended a Zoom lecture of hers during the pandemic. She is one of my favorite artists. So she performs in her artwork. She will perform. Here is Michelangelo's Pieta, and she is performing it but with black bodies. And I think her maybe most provocative work is her as a superhero freeing racist symbols like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben, freeing them from the racist logos. And her work that was done about 20 years ago is anticipating ultimately the ending of the Aunt Jemima symbol, which is a slave woman, a mammy cook, and also Uncle Ben, a slave cook who cooks rice. So those symbols finally have been enlightened and liberated from our grocery stores. Good riddance. Glenn Ligon is a black artist who is also gay and dealing with both of those potentially oppressive stereotypes. He creates two great sets of work. One are text-based paintings where a phrase from literature is repeated until it eventually disappears into the ink. And then he does these neon artworks titled America. In America, he reverses the difference between light and dark. Normally in a neon sign, the neon is light and then there would be a shadow behind it. Here, he has painted the neon black and the light comes through the back of it. The shadow and the light are reversed. And again, I think of it as really a genius idea that he's put together here. Fred Wilson completely recreates how an artist relates to a museum. Very often artists are asked to curate museum shows out of their collection on some sort of theme. In Mining the Museum in 1992 at the Maryland Historical Society, he was asked to curate a show, and he finds these beautiful pieces of silver that have been silversmithed into cups and into other vessels. He includes in this series the shackles that would have been worn by the slaves who mined the silver for it to get to the silversmith. In other words, Fred wants us to realize what the human cost of seeing these beautiful objects in the museum is. And that kind of critiquing the museum is something that many artists do today. A lot of good stuff here. April Bay is one of my favorite artists working today. She has created a world called Atlantica. She is from the Caribbean, and she was seeing the racism of tourists in her homeland, and her father created a land called Atlantica where racism doesn't exist. And her work uses textiles from Africa. Here we're seeing an image of Grace Jones and also her paintings, and we're seeing this great mythical place where you can smoke in zero gravity with the great Grace Jones, an icon for black women and also queer culture, very, very important to both. And the last thing I kind of wanted to share here with you, and I'll let you go through the other ones that I went over. This is the musician Sun Ra, and this is something known as Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism is the idea that black people are going to be here in the future. What are they going to be doing? And we see all kinds of different versions of it. Sun Ra was a jazz musician, and his garb that him and the band wear is a bit futuristic, but it also shows them as Egyptian pharaohs from the past. So here again, we see that idea of past, future, present music being played, all past, present, future being represented at once rather than singularly. And again, I personally find that idea of mixing time really, really, really fascinating. Okay, I look forward to seeing your thoughts on the art in our discussion, and I will talk to you soon, everybody. Bye-bye.